Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of day it is. Thank you for tuning in to Conversations with Dr. Don. The show is produced and broadcast from Portland, Oregon, USA. Now, for your first-time viewers, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals and about whatever it is we've decided to talk about. And this evening we'll be talking to Dr. Joe Usterman, and I've known him for years and years. And thank you for coming on this show.
Thank you for inviting me, and I want you to know I consider it a great honor to be here with you, Don.
That's a very high compliment. Thank you, because I know the work you've been doing through the years, particularly with these organizations like Matters Health Doctors and Physicians for a National Health Care Program and Health Care for All Oregon. Sounds like it's your whole life working on those kinds of issues.
It is, particularly since 2009 is when we formed the group. There were 6 of us originally, and we attracted a lot of colleagues to our group of Matters Health Doctors. We call ourselves the Matters Health Doctors of Oregon. And the reason we called ourselves the Matters Health Doctors, kind of an interesting backstory. Adam Klugman, who's Jack Klugman's son,
yes,
the great actor Jack Klugman of The Odd Couple and those series.
It was hilarious.
I just read his book called Tony and Me, which is, incidentally, for your viewers, it's a marvelous book about his great friendship with Tony Randall. But anyway, his son Adam Klugman was our kind of guru in terms of reaching out to the public with our mission of trying to bring universal health care to all Americans, what we call single payer and also called improved Medicare for all. And I was chosen since I've been a camper all my life. I was chosen to find a used RV in reasonable condition, which we could afford.
It was delightful.
And so I found this old Winnebago, and we got it all dressed up with mottos and sayings and good things. And we took it across country in 2009. I know you're aware of all of that.
Oh, yes.
But just for your viewers. And we hit 27 different cities, 47 different venues, between Sequim and Washington, D.C., Lafayette Park. And it was a tremendous experience. We found out what a real dysfunctional system we have in terms of health care in this country. We really knew it was bad, but we didn't know how bad it was.
We're going to stop you right now because we'll get to that in the second half of the show. Okay. And I'm supposed to welcome you to the show, and I'm so glad. And are you nervous?
No. No.
I am.
Oh, are you? Oh, don't, for Pete's sake.
Yeah.
No.
But anyhow, as you know, the show goes in 2 parts. The first part is talking to Dr. Joe. Can I call you Dr. Joe?
Absolutely.
About whatever else is going on, about who he is. And then we'll talk more about lessons from a long, lucky life. Lessons from a long, lucky life. You're in the process of preparing your memoirs on that.
Yes, I'm about halfway through.
Halfway through. Yeah.
Got 200 stories. I've finished about 90 of them.
Terrific. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, they're
about how long before it'll be done, you think? Another year or so?
Another year.
Oh, yeah. All right. So let's keep going here, and we'll be talking about the Matters Health Doctors and Physicians for a National Health Care Program and Health Care for All Oregon. and whatever else you've got there on those little squiggles you got that I can't read.
That's my checklist. I'm a pilot, so I have to have checklists.
You're still flying?
No.
Uh-huh.
No, I couldn't afford to do it once I retired.
Uh-huh. Okay. And I've asked you these questions before, but it's been so long ago, and besides, we've got a wider viewing audience nowadays than before. Occasionally, I'll get feedback from some foreign country, and it's just delightful with YouTube, you know?
Yeah, you bet.
So Saturday or Sunday, the show we're doing right now will be available on Don Baham YouTube. In addition to being broadcast on regular community access television a week or two from now, but I'll keep you posted on that.
Okay.
So let's start off with the usual question. If I were to ask your best friend, Dr. Joe, who is Joe Eusterman? What would your best friend say? Be your best friend. Joe is what or who?
Probably he's the most caring person you may ever meet.
Wow.
And I owe all of that to my parents. And that's just one of the reasons why I have the lucky in the title of the show tonight. Because like so many others, I was not born with 3 strikes on me. I was born with no strikes on me. There was no poverty. We were never hungry. There was no ignorance. My parents were both professionals, highly educated, and they were both humanists of the highest order. My father was a world-renowned gastroenterologist, and my mother was a nurse. And they were the finest role models anyone could ever expect. And I learned, that's one of the things that I learned was probably the most critical thing if people are going to succeed in life is who their parents are or were. And unfortunately, there are just too many people who, that's one of the strikes they have on them, that they just didn't maybe get a good set of parents or maybe no parents.
So you had the genetic component, which is very loving and beautiful, and then the environment that your parents provided and other people you hung out with, and that made you the kind human being that you are?
Yes. I was raised in a very, very strong medical environment. There are many physicians and nurses in my family. And all of that is due to my father, who was kind of started the whole program of getting involved in healthcare, taking care of people. He was, and I'm gonna say a few things about him because he deserves being said about. He was the 12th man to join the Mayo Brothers in 1908, Don.
Wow.
And so our family associations with the Mayo Clinic go back over 100 years now. And that has to be one of the absolute top medical programs in the world. And so I benefited from all of that too, some terrific minds and people absolutely dedicated. They were all on salaries. The doctors were all on salaries, and they still are at Mayo. My father's maximum salary during 42 years at Mayo was $18,000 a year.
You're kidding me. I can't be.
And he retired the policy was that they retired the doctors on a third of their maximum salary. So he retired in 1950 on $6,000 a year.
Things have changed kind of, huh?
And if I may just throw in a little story about all of that.
Speak up a little bit.
Okay.
A little louder.
All right.
Uh-huh.
He was trying to get all of us children educated and bear the expense that went with that. And his retirement income was not all that great. The clinic did help him with certain things. But one day he got a call from a gentleman in Detroit after he had retired. And this gentleman was the CEO of the Cunningham drugstore chain in Michigan. And he said, Dr. Eusterman, some friends of mine and I are starting a new Jewish hospital here in Detroit. It's going to be called Sinai Hospital, and we're looking for a chief of medicine to help get the medical department accredited. And we were wondering if we could persuade you to consider helping us here. And my father said, well, Mr. Weinstein, that's fine. I'd need to think about it a little bit. And he said, that's fine, doctor. He said, please do. Why don't you get back to me whenever you're ready? We'll go from there. 2 weeks later, my father still hadn't called him back because he was really kind of unsure what to say.
Sure.
And because Mr. Weinstein had told him he could name his salary in that first call.
Wow.
So 2 weeks later, Mr. Weinstein called again. He said, Doctor, have you thought about our need for you here? And he said, well, yes, Mr. Weinstein. He says, I don't know what to ask for in a salary. He said, would $25,000 be too much? And Mr. Weinstein said, Dr. Eusterman, we wouldn't think of paying you less than $100,000 a year.
Oh, wow.
But that was kind of another era. None of those doctors could care anything. They just didn't care anything about money. They just didn't. They were totally dedicated physicians, caregivers, scientists. And I'm just throwing that little story in because
that's beautiful.
That's the kind of thing that made me who I am. Probably I would have had a little more financial security if I had a little more thought put to money matters, but I didn't.
Interesting story. Well, let's continue on with talking about who you are for a bit now, okay? And you were born where and when?
I was born in Rochester, Minnesota, where the Mayo Clinic is, and I was born in 1929, so I'm only 85 years old.
I got you by a year.
Yeah. I'm still a squirt. Anyway, so yeah.
And you ready for your last trick question?
Sure.
Why were you born?
Well, my father and mother got together.
That's enough. It's a family show. Anything more than that? Why?
I would have to leave that to others, I think, to answer.
Yeah. Anything significant about your cultural heritage worth mentioning to our viewers? Or you're plain old American white bread?
Oh, yeah, pretty much plain old American white bread. My father was from a small town, Lewiston, Minnesota. He worked his way through medical school, selling books and playing the piano.
And playing the piano?
Yeah, and my mother, she was an amazing woman. She was from a little town in South Dakota called Del Rapids. And when she married my father, she was suddenly thrust into the world because my father had patients from all over the world. And they were so appreciative of his care that they showered the family with gifts all the time. It was just kind of constant. Everything from a watch to a Cadillac, you might say, and also many, many trips that they would invite him to come on and bring whoever he wanted. And I was lucky in that he took me on one of his trips to Africa and another one to Cuba and so on.
Wow.
So, but anyway, that's how, just another way how fortunate we all were as children. There were 5 of us. And so.
5 boys and girls?
2 boys, 3 girls.
And where are they all now?
Well, my siblings, my last sibling of the 4 just passed away this year. That was Tess. She lived in Montana, in Kalispell. And then I had my brother George. That's a whole other story, but he was an incredible guy. He was a Montanan by choice. From the day he started working as a wrangler for a dude rancher in Bozeman, Montana, when he was 16 years old. So he was a lifelong Montana, lived and breathed Montana. He could have been he knew so many people in Montana, he could have been elected governor just like that if he'd chosen to, but he was a physician also. And then I had my other two sisters, married physicians, and one lived in Denver and the other one lived in Chicago. I have 4 marvelous children, 9 marvelous grandchildren, and they're spread out kind of around the country. Yeah.
Yeah. Do they like you?
3 of my children like me. My eldest son disowned me when his mother and I divorced. And he has probably spoken only about 100 words to me in the last 35 years. And that's unfortunate, it's terrible.
Of course.
But the other 3, it's fine. We have a good relationship.
That's good.
Yeah. But those things happen,
Yeah. I have a couple of stories about one of my 5 daughters, which I won't go into now. Mm-hmm. Kind of a similar situation. Yeah. But you never know with the roll of the genetic dice and who knows what else, what you're going to get.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's good. And a religious preference, do you have one?
I'm a recovering Catholic.
Welcome to the club.
I left the church, well, I should say the church left me in 2004 when the bishops demonized John Kerry for his being unwilling to place his values or his feelings or his positions on abortion on other people. And I thought that was very unfair of the church to do that to Mr. Kerry. And at about the same time, the sexual scandals arose, and it was the kind of the combination of 2 of those things, and I just said, that's enough. I can't do it anymore. So that's what I really consider myself, like you, I think, a humanist now.
Thank you, yeah. And you've not had a practice for a number of years?
I retired in 2007 after 50 years of practice.
50 years. Mm-hmm. And what kind of specialty did you have?
Well, the first, I did my internal medicine training at Mayo. Mm-hmm. And my first practice, private practice as a solo practitioner in Albany, Oregon. One of my advisors at Mayo on my master's thesis was a fellow by the name of Dick Acor, who was a Salem native, and he knew I wanted to live in the West because I always felt so much healthier out here because I didn't have some of the allergies that I had back in Minnesota. So he said, well, Joe, do you know where you're going to live out in the West? And I said, well, I can't live in Montana. My brother has already colonized Montana. I said, I would just be under his aegis all the time. So he said, well, you really should consider the Willamette Valley. He said, I think you should take a look at the Willamette Valley. So I did. I started looking at the Pacific Northwest, and there was an ad back at Mayo. They said they needed an internist in Albany. There wasn't an internist in all of Lynn County at that time. This was 1963. So Dr. Ralph Wade persuaded me when I visited that he would give me all the support that he could financially to help me get my practice off the ground. And he had friends at the local bank who would also make me some favorable loans and so on.
Sure.
So I thought, well, you know, I was raised in a small town. I like small towns. I want to raise my kids in a small town. So I think this is a good fit for me. So I started my private practice there, and this is another story about how lucky I've been with people and patients over the years. One of my first patients was an elderly woman by the name of Mrs. Johnson. She was in her 70s, and she came in one day and she said, "Doctor, I have to find a new doctor. My doctor's retiring, and I thought I'd give the new young whippersnapper in town a chance at me." Those were her very words. And I said, "Well, that's fine, Mrs. Johnson." I said, I'll get your records, and we'll set up an appointment for you, and I'll get a history from you, and we'll do an examination. We may have to run some tests, kind of see where you are." So we did all that, and she came back for a follow-up visit to get the results of my evaluation in about 2 weeks. And she said, "Well, how am I doing, doctor?" And I said, "Well, Mrs. Johnson, you're really doing amazingly well, considering." And she said, just like what you did, she blinked. And she said, "What do you mean, considering, doctor?" And I said, "Well, Mrs. Johnson, considering the fact that you're taking 13 different prescription drugs, and this has always been a problem in certain areas or communities when one doctor doesn't know what the other doctors are doing, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And they don't check, they don't. Anyway, so she said, "Well, what should I do?" And I said, "I want you to stop 10 of them." And she said, "Well, which 10, doctor?" And I said, "Any 10, Mrs. Johnson. You pick the ones, you stop 10, and we'll get you back here in a couple of weeks, make sure you're getting along okay." She says, "Well, all right, doctor. I'm not so sure about this, but all right." In 2 weeks, she came back, and she said, "Doctor, I'm a new woman." She said, "I'm even getting my nasty thoughts back again." And she knew everybody in town. She told everybody in town what I'd done for her, that I was not a pill pusher, and that she made my practice just boom. I never had an empty spot on my calendar after that time on my schedule. So I was lucky again there.
There's something more than luck involved here. There's something Mom and Dad
Well,
gave
it's
you
training. It was my training at Mayo too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the training was so good and is so good that you have confidence. You have great confidence that if you spend enough time with people, they'll tell you what's wrong with them. That was an aphorism of Sir William Osler, who was a famous Canadian physician. Mm-hmm. He says, "Give people enough time to talk and listen, and they'll tell you what's wrong with them. Yeah. They'll make the diagnosis for you." And unfortunately, now there's so much pressure on doctors to grind people through that there's so little time spent that there's a lot of misdiagnosis.
Yes.
And as a result of that misdiagnosis, there's unfortunately a lot of injuries a lot of illness being created because definitive diagnosis, I'm afraid, has become a lost art, and primarily due to the pressures of production.
Yeah. Well, as you were saying that, I was thinking, I have a small practice in an office in my home right now.
I know.
As a psychologist.
Mm-hmm. I know.
And
I love your website. I hope everybody studies your website because it's terrific.
Thank you. But I think about a client who I just learned, I've seen her a few times, but she's seeing, I think, 5 different medical professionals, an acupuncturist, an internist, and who knows who else. I lost count of the number of medications she's taking. But she's almost hysterical off and on. I don't want to go into it. You don't know who she is. But the point I'm getting to is, I finally said to her, you're going to need to stop all of those. But which ones do I stop, those medications? I says, well, you're going to need to decide, because you're not playing with a full deck now. You're chemically influenced. You think you're rational now, but you're not. I didn't jump into it that quickly. Slowly it came out. Because she could then hear me, because I listened to her carefully, not just what she was saying, but you and I are on the same page. Yeah. And we'll see how she does before I see her next week again. She's in a tough spot.
When I started in private practice of internal medicine, I allowed my morning hours, office hours, were from 8 to 12. Mm-hmm. I saw 2 or 3 patients in those 4 hours, new patients. So that's how much time. I took an average of an hour and a quarter with each new patient on the first visit. And then in the afternoon, I'd have 10 or 15 follow-up visits between 1 and 5. And then I made morning rounds before morning office hours, and then I made evening rounds at the hospital after. But I did that for the first 20 years of my medical life, and then I got an offer from the Boeing company that I couldn't refuse. So the last 30 years of practice involved taking care of injured workers. What we call occupational medicine.
Yes.
So I got board certified in the subspecialty of preventive medicine, which includes occupational and environmental medicine. Mm-hmm. And that was when I was about 60 years old. Got through all the tests, studied crazily for a whole year to get through those tests at that age. But I made it, and those last 30 years were so satisfying to me, and those workers taught me so much about what the average working grunt in our culture has to put up with just so he doesn't lose his job, or get a supervisor thinking he's looking at him the wrong way. And that's one of the reasons that in my Mad as Hell Minute up in Sequim, Washington, that Mad as Hell Minute, when all 6 of us doctors were asked to explain why we were mad as hell. Mm-hmm. And I'm getting away, and we're getting into the second again, but the segment that's on YouTube shows that Mad as Hell Minute, and basically I was just very angry about all of the fear-mongering that was going on about socialized medicine and all mm-hmm. this stuff. And I've seen working people live in fear every day of their working lives because of possibly rubbing their supervisor or boss the wrong way and losing their job.
And you've seen that going on for a long time?
Yeah, I've seen it going on for a long time.
Yeah. So let's continue on so we mm-hmm. can have enough time for what's...
Sure.
You have a partner, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, or wife, or something?
No, I'm married.
Of course.
My second wife. We've been married 35 years.
35.
Now.
Yeah.
And she saved my life in so many ways because I was pretty unhappy in my first marriage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the second marriage has been good, and she's still around.
She's still around. She retired. She's a nurse practitioner, an adult nurse practitioner. She retired. Her name is Mary. She retired just a few years ago. So.
When's the last time you told Mary that you love her?
Today.
Oh, do it again. Look in that camera and tell her how you feel about her.
I love you, baby. And you know I love you. And I know you love me.
Yeah, and I'm pretty good at checking his eyes, so he's serious, as you always
know.
Was
I looking in the right camera?
They change cameras on us.
Oh, they
it's
do?
Okay.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, and would you characterize yourself as a Donald Trump supporter, or you're a leftist or a centrist or what? Bernie Sanders, your toilet right there when you're button.
That's a silly question from you with that button staring you in the face.
Yeah.
No, I'm a Bernie guy, and and I hope that Elizabeth Warren chooses to run with him as vice president. But we'll see.
Yeah. Memberships in political, social, or civic organizations worth mentioning.
I've never been that great into those kinds of things, just too busy. I was in Rotary for a while, but no, my main associations are right now is healthcare for all Oregonians. That's a major part of my efforts right now. And then I'm working hard for Bernie now too. We need to get our democracy back,
Yes.
Dr. Don.
Yes. We don't disagree. One more question before we take a break and then go with your notes here, because we're going to need about 14 more hours to cover your notes.
Yes.
One more last question. What's right with America? Because I'm going to ask you what's wrong with America when we finish with this first half of the question. What's right with America?
Well, one of the things right with America is its beauty. Another thing is right with its people. The great majority of Americans are good folks. They're just good folks. Every society has some crazies, and they need help, but they need it sooner than they usually often get it, if at all. But again, working with everyday working folks has taught me a huge respect for that group of people.
Yes. So that's what's right with America. It's people and its beauty, and anything else comes to mind? What's right with America?
Well, I think its Constitution.
Okay.
Its Constitution is right there, but at the same time, we need to have amendments to make it really work for the present time.
Yeah. Some more New Deal kinds of things.
Yeah, I think we just have to do something about Citizens United and you know, the money in politics, particularly.
What's wrong with America? You only have about a minute and a half for that because we can't go on forever.
Oh, golly. I think we need to make health care available, accessible to all people, and I think we need to make public or private education available to all people. I think we have too many folks in the country who have not had the benefit of a good education, and they can be easily swayed by people who are more interested in staying in office than doing what's right for the country.
Or making money.
Yeah.
All right, let's take a break now and then come back and talk about whatever else we're going to talk about. Okay, we're back. Thanks for staying tuned. And for you viewers who missed the opening of the show, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of 1 hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as unique, one of a kind individuals. And Dr. Joe Usterman is certainly interesting. And we'll be talking some more about how he is about with his memoirs, about his life, and about lessons for a long, lucky life. We've talked a little bit about why your life has been long and lucky, and we'll go more into it. But let's let you lead off in the second half and see what we will talk about and what I'll listen to.
Okay. As I was kind of gathering my thoughts for this show, it occurred to me that I needed to explain why I wanted to talk about lessons, I guess. And one of the great lessons of many was from my father. When I was very young, I was about 8 or 9 years old, a friend of mine and I decided to take what we used to call a bike hike in those days, a long bicycle ride. And
that was in the 30s, huh?
That was in the 30s. That was in the 30s, and we decided we were going to ride our bikes from Rochester to Orinoco, Minnesota, and where there was a nice lake. And there was a distance about 13 miles one way, and we had to ride on one of the main highways at that time between Rochester and Minneapolis was Highway 52, two-lane highway. And we were gone all day, and when I got back, my father asked me where I'd been. And I said, oh, Don and I just took a bike ride. He said, Joe, he said, you took more than a bike ride. You were out riding on one of the main highways for a distance of about 20 to 25 miles. That was poor judgment on your case. And in your case, he said, I don't want you to make any excuses, Joe, because none are acceptable. That was a good lesson. Then he proceeded to take me down to the woodshed. We had a kindling room downstairs, and he'd always take a piece of kindling out and show me the one with the nail on one end, but then he'd always turn it around and give me a few whacks with that. But then he said, you're not going to be able to ride your bike for the rest of the summer. So that was the real crusher. So anyway, I learned that you don't make excuses and you never lie. You just never lie. And that was a really good lesson at an early age.
Made an impression on you.
It really did. One time also I witnessed he and my mother having a pretty heated verbal exchange, and he saw me standing in one just outside the kitchen door, and he could tell that I was upset because I'd never seen them argue that much before. And so after they finished, he took me aside and he said, Joe, I can tell that you're a little upset. He said, but I want you to understand something. He said, I would have left your mother long ago, but her good points outweighed her bad. Now that was another good lesson for me at that point. It was not only reassuring, but it taught me that it's important to give people the benefit of the doubt. And we all make mistakes, and that you just don't judge people prematurely. prematurely, if at all. So that was another good lesson. I mentioned a little while ago that I was born with no strikes on me. And I think some of the real heroes in life are the people who were born with 3 strikes, all 3 strikes on them. Poverty, ignorance, unfortunate parentage. And to me, those that overcome those 3 strikes, to me, are some of the real heroes in life. How they make a success, not only of their lives, but they understand, they learn to become good parents and prevent that cycle of, repeat generations of problem people. There's we talked about the importance of caring and thoroughness. I've been fortunate to have some interesting patients. Took care of Edward R. Murrow when I was in the Navy in Bethesda Naval Hospital, and that's another story. It's not always what you know, but it's who you know. I was finishing my residency at Mayo, and I was in the neurology department, and we had a patient who was an admiral's wife. And I was making rounds on her at the hospital. She was in for some tests. And she said, "Doctor, what are your plans for the future?" And I said, "Well, Mrs. Burns, I have an obligation to be in the armed forces for at least 2 years. I've been on the Berry plan to get through my education with the understanding that I would then go and put in at least 2 years of armed service."
Sure.
She said, "Well, do you know what branch you're going to be going into?" And I said, "Well, it's odd you should ask. I just got my orders. I'll be in the Navy, and I just got my orders." She says, "Well, where are you going?" And I said, "Well, they've assigned me to the dispensary in the Capitol in Washington, D.C. And I'm not going to repeat her language because it would not be suitable, I think, for this venue.
Thank you.
But she had a very salty language, being a Navy wife.
Yes.
And she said, in effect, "Doctor, you're not going to that awful place." She reached over and she picked up her phone. She dialed a number. She says, "John, I have this young doctor here, and they've assigned him to that damn Capitol dispensary. Now, John, I want him in Bethesda Naval Hospital. Not just there," he says, "I want him taking care of the high-ranking naval personnel, Marine personnel, and government personnel. You got that, John? Thank you very much." Boom. 3 days later, new orders.
Oh, you talk about juice.
Yeah. So that's another time I was lucky.
Yeah.
But I in those 2 years, I had the great experiences. Some not so great. The one with Lyndon Johnson was not so great. But with Edward R. Murrow and Edith Green, who was a representative from Oregon at that time in the Congress, and I just want to tell you, if I may, a couple quick stories about them.
Please do.
Edward R. Murrow came in for a checkup, and I was assigned to take care of him. At that time, he was head of the U.S. Information Agency.
Yes,
This was in 1962. And I wasn't getting a report back on his chest x-ray from the radiology department. So I went down and pulled out his chest x-ray and looked at it myself because I wanted to get him the results of his evaluation.
Sure.
And I noticed a small pea-sized lesion in the left upper lung. And it had these dendrites going out from it, these little branches. God, you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
And it was pathognomonic, typical of a small cell carcinoma of the lung. Probably the most virulent kind of cancer of the lung that you can have, of any cancers, for that matter. So I had to tell Mr. Murrow that he had lung cancer. And he said, well, doctor, he said, I'm not surprised. He says, you know my smoking history. And I said, yes.
Oh, yes.
I do, Mr. Murrow. I've seen you on your television programs, and you always had a cigarette going. He said, yes, so I'm not surprised, doctor. He said, and the next thing out of his mouth was, what are your plans for the future, doctor? He didn't say, oh, doctor, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Blah, blah, blah. There was none of that. There was absolutely no self-pity or self-anything.
No wasting time.
He just turned it all back to me. He said, what are you going to be doing? So I told him that I was going to be practicing in Oregon. He said, you know, he says, I'm from Walla Walla. I said, I didn't know that. He said, I'm from Walla Walla. He says, I've got some great friends in the Pacific Northwest. As a matter of fact, they've just sent me a lot of Port Orford cedar paneling for my study in my new home up in Poughkeepsie. And I said, well, that's very, very nice. He said, you're going to love the Pacific Northwest. He says, I miss it. So that was Edward R. Murrow. The other patient was Edith Green. These were inspiring people. Of so many people that I've had as patients who have inspired me. Edith Green came in for a checkup. I was again assigned to take care of her. And one day I walked into her hospital room and she was in obvious pain. She was grimacing like this, you know, just. And I said, Mrs. Green, what, you're obviously in pain. What's the matter? She said, oh, I'm just having one of my headaches. I said, Mrs. Green, you didn't tell me about your headaches when I took your history. She said, doctor, I've gotten so tired of telling doctors about my headaches because they can never do anything about them. And I said, well, it's just headaches happen to be a special interest of mine. I was fortunate to be mentored in that subspecialty by Dr. Baird Horton, one of the world experts on headache problems. He gave me a book about headaches with 176 different kinds of headaches. Tell me about your headache. Well, she had a classic migraine headache, and she was having 2 or 3 a week.
Oh.
And yet she brought all this work into the hospital with her. She was so dedicated as a public servant. She had tons of work that she brought into the hospital with her. And obviously she had to keep up that workload in spite of these headaches. And I said, Mrs. Green, there's a new medicine out. It's called Sansert. The generic name is methizergide. I said, it seems to be very effective for your type of headache. She said, well, if my doctor back in Portland says it's okay, she said, I'd like to try it. I said, well, what's his name? His name is Dr. Morton Goodman. I said, okay, I'll call Dr. Goodman. I called him from her hospital room, and I explained the situation. He said, please go ahead, Dr. Eastman, go ahead, please. Make a long story short, she got immediate relief. We got her headaches immediately controlled. And I think on any group of patients, my headache patients were always the ones that seemed to be most grateful when I was able to help them with their headaches.
Oh, yes.
She sent me a Christmas card every Christmas until she died. She was that kind of a person. She just never forgot me. And interestingly, when we moved to Charbonneau about 7 years ago, we just sold our home there because we were moving into a retirement community called Rose Villa. At Charbonneau, there was an athletic field right behind our house at the time. And they decided to name that Edith Green Park. Uh-huh. It's interesting how those things seem to come full circle.
Yes.
So anyway, that's just a couple stories about wonderful patients. Oh, I got to tell you one more.
Yes.
I got to tell you about a very large African-American woman.
We got about 4 or 5 minutes left
okay.
for this.
This is another way I was lucky. When I was a medical student in our junior year one of the subspecialties that we had to learn about was obstetrics and gynecology.
Mm-hmm.
And part of our training in gynecology was that we would go down to Minneapolis General Hospital, and the patients there were charity patients in the main, and so they were asked if they would allow students to examine them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that particular lesson that day was to learn how to do pelvic examinations. And so we were warned that if there was something to be found in the female pelvis that we didn't find, it would affect our grade for the course negatively. So I was working very, very assiduously trying to make sure that I was feeling everything I should feel in this large African-American woman's pelvis.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd been going at it pretty aggressively, and she finally raised her head and looked at me between the stirrups, and she said, "Doctor, you better stop. You're going to ring my bell." Is that okay story to tell?
I think so. We swept under the censors.
And we both started giggling. It took me a little while to understand what she was talking about.
She had a sense of humor.
I was so damn naive in those days.
Yeah.
But she was a sweetie. She was just a terrific lady. I had so much respect for her trying to be helpful to me and at the same time setting a limit, you know.
Yeah.
She was a delight. And I think she was one of many African Americans that who's interacting with helped me totally avoid being a racist, and I feel good about being able to say that.
You should. Well, let's take a minute or so for you to tell the viewers anything that comes to mind right now.
Okay.
And
okay.
We're going to have you look in this camera and talk to them. I think they're going to leave us on that one. And just take a minute and a half, anything you want to say about what happened this evening or anything else comes to mind, because then I'm going to read my poem about my friend the dog.
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Dr. Don, I think...
You can tell the viewers or me?
I think I've covered most of the thoughts that I prepared for this evening.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I just want to express my appreciation to you. This is a great show.
Thank you.
I have a feeling it's underappreciated and underviewed, but I may be wrong about that. But as I mentioned to you when we were off camera, I want to get to know you better, Dr. Don.
So do I. We will arrange that.
Okay.
Yes, thank you so much. I feel so flattered with what you just said to me, but let's go on because time is still running down at the clock.
I want to hear your poem.
Yeah. My neighbor about 3 houses up the street from where I live in Beaverton had a dog who just died recently, and this poem is about Baron, who passed away. And I found out that I was more attached, or at least as attached to the dog as my neighbor was, because I found I'm grieving since about a week ago, and I'm saying, what's going on? It's his dog, because I'm such a tender-hearted person anyhow. So I wrote this poem, and here it goes now. It's called Baron's Smile, by me on October 20, 2015. And I was feeling kind of stroke deprived, and I'd often wander up the street to Barron's to dependably replenish my stroke supply. 3 houses up the street, lying in his human's driveway, he'd sense my presence, look up, half growl or whine, and smile. Except on rare occasion when he'd grin, and my horse soaring brought to consciousness the reason for this wandering. And last week, Barron died quietly in his sleep. And at least once a day since, I wander up the street supposedly to visit Barron's human, despite knowing that Barron is gone and that Scott is quietly grieving his loss. I grieve losing Barron, and I'm missing his smile. But the memory of his grin will last forever in my stroke bank to draw upon on those rare occasions when all seems cloudy and gray, and they can't take that away from me. Goodbye, Barron. Okay. You have time for a PSA, 1 or 2 before it's time to quit, Mr. Director. Thank you. Oh, we've got to tell you about the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. Without the ACLU, our country's civil liberties would be totally down the tube. And I got to tell you about how to end corporate personhood. We got to move to amend, move to amend the Constitution that says corporations are not persons and money is not speech. To learn more about humanists and humanism, go to that website, the American Humanist website, and learn more about humanists and humanism, because I think Dr. Joe agrees that's a good idea.
Yes.
And the Alliance for Democracy, a wonderful organization that I belong to. Go to the national website and learn about the Alliance for Democracy. It's a great organization. We work for issues to do with justice and those kinds of things that are associated with the real democracy. And I got to remind you to remember KFC, not Kentucky Fried Chicken, Dr. Don's KFC. Kind, friendly, and charitable. To you too, Mike. To you too, Dr. Joe. And to you too, Mr. E. And everybody else watching. And we'll see you next time. Thanks again for watching.